Welcome to the 100th episode of the FieldLink Podcast. We want to thank all of you, as our loyal listeners, for helping make the FieldLink Podcast a success. Well, there is certainly a lot of news coming out of Washington, D.C. today that will impact growers. On this FieldLink episode, we catch up with Andrew Walmsley, Vice President of Government Relations for the CPDA. That's the Council of Producers, Distributors of Agrotechnologies. Andrew sits down with us to discuss how the Endangered Species Act will impact growers in 2026. Plus, we'll cover everything from the big, beautiful bill and how restructuring the EPA will impact growers in the future. Plus, Jody Lawrences joins us from Nashville to discuss the quarterly stocks report from the USDA and how a government shutdown could impact the USDA market reports. Stay tuned for this 100th episode of FieldLink. And welcome to this 100th episode of the FieldLink Podcast. We're really excited. We're reporting today. I got a podcast studio set up in Lake Geneva, Illinois at the Crop Life and CPDA annual conference. And we're really excited to have joining us today Andrew Walmsley. Andrew works in Washington, and he's directly involved with a lot of policy that's taking place for agriculture today. Andrew, welcome to FieldLink.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. Andrew, first up, a lot of our listeners aren't exactly maybe familiar with CPDA. Why don't you tell us what CPDA is and, what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. So CPDA is the Council of Producers and Distributors of Agrotechnology. Not sure who came up with that. That's a mouthful, but
it is.
Mostly known as CPDA. We represent the post-patent generic pesticide manufacturers, the inerts and adjuvant manufacturers, and then those distributors. So if you look at the CPDA membership, we're 83 member companies strong. We represent about 90% of the $15 billion crop protection market. And so we really advocate for our members' interest at the federal level, whether that's before Congress or the administration. A lot of work with the Environmental Protection Agency. Obviously, that's kind of our licensing arm to be able to get these important tools into the hands of growers. But then also in state affairs, we kind of keep track of issues as they pop up. California can be a challenge for all of us in agriculture. And a lot of times what happens in California shifts to other states, but constantly kind of keeping tabs on state legislatures and regulatory processes at that level. So I've been with CPDA a little over a year. Before that, I spent almost 20 years working at Farm Bureau, at a state Farm Bureau, then American Farm Bureau. So kind of been a lobby jockey, a lobbyist, as you would say, for that time. And so a lot of my day-to-day is obviously working for our members, addressing their concerns, being a resource. But we work, again, closely with, in particular, the Office of Pesticide Programs at EPA, but then work with the relevant committees of jurisdiction in the House and Senate. A lot of that's the Agriculture Committee. Also really closely on appropriators with appropriations for EPA and having the resources they need to fund programs so we can get tools in the hands of farmers. And then the administration, working with the agencies, working with the White House. So it's never a dull day, especially in these times, but feel very fortunate to work for this industry and really love what I get to do. So I'm glad to be here to talk about it.
Definitely not a slow time in Washington. But Andrew, before we dive into the weeds of what's going on in D.C. and some of the things you're doing with CPDA, let's talk a little bit more about you. You referenced, you've been with Farm Bureau. You've kind of worked that network. You're a lobby jockey, to your words. Grew up in Florida. Tell us a little bit about home, how you grew up. What's your background there?
Yeah, no, I'm a sixth-generation Floridian, so my family goes pretty far back, actually before Florida was a state. Kind of grew up with some cattle and citrus. My uncle was the extension agent in our county, but I actually moved away from the farm when I was pretty young. And my dad actually worked for a tobacco company, so we moved around a lot for that. So not a traditional, ag kid growing up, but kind of always exposed to it. I ended up going to the University of Florida and jokingly got a degree in tractor driving. I thought I was going to go into production agriculture. The actual term is ag operations management.
Wow,
so
okay.
In the ag engineering department. But Florida Farm Bureau was hiring right out of school. And I kind of grew up in the policy sphere. My grandfather was a county commissioner and a city manager. My mom ended up being a city commissioner. So I grew up going to public meetings and going to the state capitol for different things. So kind of had this exposure. And really it was just a good fit. And so I've fallen in love with, obviously our industry, and I've always had a passion for, but the policy making, and, with that focus that was instilled in me early, starting out at Farm Bureau, was, waking up every day and trying to figure out how do you keep a nickel in a farmer's pocket, whether that's from the government stealing it or trying to find new markets, new opportunities to put a nickel back in their pocket. So that's kind of been the lens I've always looked through. Again, economics is what drives anything. We talk a lot about sustainability, but you can't be very sustainable if you're not profitable. And so that's the lens I've kind of looked through with policy, and that's really what we try to do at CPDA, right? We're an advocacy association, but we're also a business council. And so bringing people together, bringing our industry together, and then finding those ways to work collaboratively for the betterment of rural America and our industry.
Well, Andrew, we talked a little bit earlier as we were preparing for this podcast that there's not a shortage of things going on in Washington today. And one of the things that's on top of mind for a lot of growers is the Farm Bill and just the general economy. From your day-to-day experience, I mean, on the Hill, talking to, legislators, talking to other advisors for the presidency, what are you learning? What's your take? What should growers know today from your seat on the bus?
Yeah, no, I think the key is that as messy as politics can be, and what you might hear on different talk shows and how divisive this country seems to be at this point, there's still a lot of good people in Washington, particularly in the ag community that's up there representing growers. And there's a lot of good lawmakers that do understand agriculture. They have a passion for representing growers. And then there's a lot that don't, but are interested. And so part of my job is to go out there and tell our story and bring those challenges that the countryside's facing, so those policymakers have a better understanding on how difficult it is right now. For the growers listening, I'm not telling you anything new. It's tough times. And, we're kind of reaching a fever pitch that it is getting into Washington. You've seen the president make an announcement here about a week ago looking at potential assistance. You've had the, Ag Secretary Brooke Rawlings out talking about, next steps on some of the economic assistance and flexibilities that they have. And then you've got, the chairman and ranking members of both the House and Senate Ag Committee fully understanding that. And so if my crystal ball was clear, I could tell you we're going to have a Farm Bill 2.0 or this or that. I'd probably be a lot wealthier man, but there's definitely that momentum building. And, we can't also lose sight. If you look back in December, you had the American Relief Act that had both disaster assistance, which still hasn't been rolled out by USDA. We've kind of had the first tranche of payments on some of the ECAP, the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program. But I think there's a recognition more needs to come just because of elevated input prices, particularly on the fertilizer side. We've got low commodity prices. And then we've got this whole trade issue that I know is frustrating a lot of growers. And you look at how important trade is to agriculture. 96% of the world's population is outside our borders, and we've worked a really long time to try to be a good, reliable trading partner. We all know the American farmer produces probably one of the best products in the world, but it's not the only product in the world. And so this is a real challenge that I think a lot of growers are willing to ride with the president to get us better market access and better trade deals. But there is this reality that there's this real financial strain out there that, you talk to farm credit folks and other folks in the industry, that's really becoming a concern. And how do we navigate that?
Andrew, I think there's I guess, I don't know what the best way to say, maybe a bit of a reality check. We've been in such a leadership position in agriculture globally for 50, 60, 70, 80 years or more. And a lot of countries are catching up and doing a good job. We're truly in a supply challenge, and that's impacting some of these trade conversations that you get to deal with in DC and we as an industry are dealing with today.
The innovation and efficiency of the American farmers, second to none. I mean, you look at, again, our sustainability story and what we've been able to produce. I mean, we've almost increased our outputs in nearly 300% in roughly 2 generations. I mean, it's the innovation that we have in this country, the ability to adopt new technologies. But then we've also made smart investments on, infrastructure issues. We're blessed with an inland waterway system that allows a, cost competitive advantage to some of our trading partners. We've got a rail network that when it works, it's great. There's obviously some growers out there that are ended up being captive shippers and have some of those challenges, but that's that infrastructure that's kind of put us ahead on some of the price points, particularly when you look at Brazil. But you've got China investing and Brazil building out infrastructure. So it is becoming more competitive. And that's just in a normal trade scenario. Now you add in the tariffs. on just how tough it is, both on products coming in on the input side to obviously, being able to export and have those trading partners work with us. And again, we're all hoping for better trade deals. I think that's definitely where the president's heart is, and a lot of the industry's with him on that. But there's just a reality of how much pain we can take, and the pain's pretty real.
Yeah. Let's peel the trade thing back a little bit further here, because it is certainly top of mind for a lot of producers, specifically when we talk about soybeans. What are you seeing? What are some of the conversations in Washington right now as we talk about soybeans and that side of things in terms of trade?
Yeah, no, and we've seen some announcements here recently that from the administration that obviously upset a lot of our soybean farmers. China is a huge market for them. I think at one point every third row of soybeans in this country was going to China, and Brazil's been such a competitor in this space. And now you've got China obviously wanting to trade with them. You've got the issue with Argentina and the recent announcement, some economic assistance to Argentina, and soybean growers are going, what are we doing here? Kind of thing. But that is definitely the challenge, particularly for, the soybeans, but it's all commodities, right? And that's one of the things. We've got so many partners in the space with some of the checkoff programs, a lot of our trade promotion folks, of trying to find new markets. And so hopefully through all this, we will become a little less reliant maybe on one or two trading partners, that we can continue to push open new markets. But then where you just look where demand and where we're at production, we really need all markets.
And I think that's a great point. Trade's getting a lot of attention, obviously, right now. We're talking tariffs, but, we have to look within too, don't we? In terms of how can we create some markets, demand internally for our own products.
Right. I mean, there's so much, again, technology and new uses. And I think there's so much research investment. That's why public research dollars are so incredibly important. It's also private research dollars are so incredibly important to find new markets. You look at on the renewable fuel side, particularly for the corn equation, that drives so much demand. And if we can find new demand, new uses, even if it's a commodity or two, it's kind of the whole thought of, a high tide lifts all ships.
Right.
And so if we can overall help the general farm economy, it's what we've got to continue to do, just to invest and innovate and find new uses.
Right. Well, certainly a lot of attention around ethanol right now and other biofuels. Where do you feel, how's the conversation happening right now in DC as it relates to that space?
Yeah, there's been obviously battles over the years, and back in the early days of my career, the kind of the food versus fuel debate, I think that's kind of been settled out, where we still get so much use out of that kernel of corn, and you had that value add on the ethanol piece. We had some of the issues with our livestock producers and corn growers. We really figured out how to co-work together on those with DDGs and some of those uses that have created their own markets. So it's obviously continue to defend the renewable fuel standard, but the big push by the agents or by the industry is trying to get year-round E15. There's been this flexibility from previous administration, this administration, on suspending some of the restrictions on summertime use. It's a volatility issue, not to get real technical, but that does have a cost impact. That does kind of hold back some demand. And so, we've got in Congress, this is one bill that they've been able to pass, I think, close to 60 something years, if not 60 years, is the National Defense Authorization Act. It's one of those must pass bills. So some of those things you look for trains leaving the station. I mean, there's been some amendments filed to try to get that year-round E15 fix in there. Again, if you recall last December, the original omnibus package, before some of the DOGE efforts got into it, that fix was in there. There's kind of been this agreement within the refining industry and ag to address this issue, just because of the uncertainty. Unfortunately, that was pulled out. So now there's been some focus on trying to resolve that issue through National Defense Authorization Act. So again, just one of these weird, wonky, moving pieces that, for us in ag, we try to look for any opportunity to benefit a grower, but it's a lot to keep track of, especially as we get through the end of the year. You've got funding the government issues, the Farm Bill 2.0, which I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about. And, whatever happens on government funding, long-term, short-term shutdowns, it's still fiscal year, next year type things. And all these pieces aren't going to be settled anytime soon.
Yeah, we're a little bit ahead of this recording. Lots of chatter about the shutdown, but let's peel back a little bit. Farm Bill 2.0. How do you feel? Where are we really at right now in DC? What's the tone there?
Well, we can't lose sight of what was in the one big, beautiful bill. There was a lot of work, particularly producer focused on an incredible investment into agriculture, $60+ billion, one of the largest, farm program specific investments since I believe the 2002 Farm Bill. So you saw some improvements to crop insurance, to the safety net, PLC and ARC, those programs, which are going to pay dividends long term, but unfortunately they don't kick in until 2026. So some of those, that growing season, we're not going to see those immediate benefits. Also, the process with the One Big Beautiful Bill was done through reconciliation. And so reconciliation is where one party controls all three branches of government, and you do it through a process called budget reconciliation. This is to get around the filibuster in the Senate. So typically you have to have 60 votes in the Senate, but a reconciliation bill you can pass on a simple majority, but it also limits what you can do in those bills. You can't just write any policy. They have to have a budgetary impact. It goes through what's called the bird bath. It's just a rule with the parliamentarian that, the minority party can challenge. But basically to say that is you couldn't do everything you would normally do in a normal farm bill because of those restrictions. So there was the investments there, but Congress still needs to act on either reauthorizing, extending the 2018 Farm Bill. I don't think anyone in the industry wants to continue that process. It's time to finish the complete package. And so there's been a lot of talk, definitely a lot of desire for Chairman Thompson in the House, working with Senator Bozeman in the Senate, to do what's basically a Farm Bill 2.0, all those programs that couldn't be part of the One Big Beautiful Bill. I know kind of behind the scenes staff have been working and sharing priorities between majority and minority. I think there's some hope that there could be some movement, particularly in the House come October, that we'll see a bill that's probably going to be very similar to what passed out of the House Agriculture Committee in last May of 2024. That's kind of the blueprint they're working with. We have a new ranking member in the House and Senate with Angie Craig in the House and Amy Klobuchar in the Senate. So working through their priorities and try to do it in a bipartisan way. Again, this is a challenge because, the One Big Beautiful Bill and reconciliation was very partisan. And both sides do it when they have that. But there's still some of those implications from that to work through on top of the bigger political issue.
Right. There's still a lot of jockeying going around to get this 2.0 put together. Do you have a sense for timeline? I mean, best case scenario, and I'm sure it's a moving target.
It is a moving target. I mean, Congress does have to do something by the end of this year. So current farm policy expires at the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. We really don't see some of the impacts from not acting till January 1. That's when we start reverting back to some of the permanent law, we call it, policies from the 30s and 40s that just don't meet current market demands. It's kind of that trigger we always keep in a farm bill to force Congress to act. So if we can get the funding piece all figured out and both sides of the table genuinely working towards a Farm Bill 2.0, our chances, I think, are as good as they can be in D.C. I mean, it's still an uncertainty, but probably not till December. I mean, that's really when the pressure is. Congress really doesn't know how to act until there's a deadline staring them in the face. So there's that extra pressure to get something done, or we just see an extension again. But there's some type of action that Congress needs to take before the end of the year.
Andrew, certainly a lot going on in terms of the two topics we've just talked about, trade and policy as it relates to the Farm Bill. Let's kind of fast forward a little bit, though, to some of the things that you're working with your colleagues and industry partners at CPDA as it relates to working through this regulatory backlog. I mean, that's been a topic on this podcast, but also across all of media. And these are real things that growers are faced with today, as well as the industry in terms of regulations. What are some topics there, and where do you see this going?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously we work on all these big picture issues, want to be supportive of our, growers, but then where we really focus in is CPDA and working closely with CLA and others that we kind of call the PREA coalition. We love acronyms and
it's a lot of acronyms. CPDA to begin with.
Yeah. CLA, Crop Life America.
Which is a coalition of industry as well, looking out for the grower, of course, and of course the manufacturer.
How you tend to be more successful in Washington is work in coalitions. The more people that you have rowing in the same direction, you tend to be more successful. If you ever give a lawmaker a choice, that's a death nail, because that'll give them an out and they won't ever be able to make a decision. It's easier to tell you no. So it is a lot about coalition work. And so clearly, there's the regulatory burdens that land at the farmer's gate, and we'll talk a little bit more of some of those that they can start expecting in the pesticide space. But for us, it's a kind of an interesting position. A lot of folks, particularly on the Republican side and even some on the Democratic side, don't always love EPA. And one of the things that we actually do is that, hey, we want more funding for EPA. Specifically, though, the Office of Pesticide Programs. Leave some of the other issues off the table, but that's one of those key statutory functions that the agency has to do, kind of our license to operate as an industry. We have the gold standard when you look at reviewing pesticides, you looking at re-registration over the years, being able to bring new technologies to market. You have this process that has to go through a review. And again, everyone agrees, and you even saw it in the MAHA, Make America Healthy Again report, which we did a lot of work on from where we were in May to the strategy that came out to September. But that kind of strategy report pointed to EPA's programs to give some consumer confidence. And so we as an industry are looking to make sure that it's funded in a way that it functions. And unfortunately, for the last several years, due to multiple issues, you have COVID and workforce issues within the agency. You also have the agency that gets sued and then have to meet these court orders and decisions on top of their regulatory load. But really what we're looking at as an association at CPDA, we have almost $500 million worth of members' products stuck in this regulatory backlog. And so clearly that's a frustration from an industry standpoint, from a business standpoint. You don't necessarily have a lot of transparency. You miss a growing season, that hits a huge economic hit. But the bigger issue, and what we really try to point to, is that it's the grower that suffers at the end of the day. It's fewer tools in the toolbox. It's maybe some of the newer technologies not getting in their hands, but it's also the proven technologies that CPDA members make that provide growers options that are being held up. And so a lot of our work is trying to get the resources from the funding side for Office of Pesticide Programs, but we also work very closely with the team there, Ed Messina, who leads the Office of Pesticide Programs, really good with looking at process improvements. How can we as an industry work better with the agency to reduce their workload? And so that is a lot of the work we do with the whole end inside of making sure farmers have choice and consumers have confidence in that regulatory system.
I think that's a really important point for producers and listeners on this podcast to understand is step back in time. 6, 8, 10, 15 years ago, it would take how long to get a product labeled through EPA, roughly?
There's some statutory deadlines which they haven't met, but closer to maybe a handful of years. Now we're 10, 12 years, depending on some of this. And some of the, kind of easier Me Too decisions on products that have been there, that have been reviewed and always gone through, they continue to not meet that deadline. And again, it's that frustration of how do you plan for business, but ultimately the grower not getting the tools they need. But I do have to say, with this administration, this is something that CPA is really focused on. We have the transition team working with our coalition partners, getting in early on pointing out this issue and some points of improvement that we think the new administration could take under consideration. Had meetings at the White House at that level, talking about how important that part of EPA is, and obviously continuing to talk on the Hill. And we've seen some progress. I mean, I can't remember the last time an EPA administrator is talking about the pesticide backlog. And he's done that 4 separate occasions in congressional hearings this year. Since January 20th, we were looking at probably 13 to 14,000 backlog cases. We've been able to reduce those by 5,000. So some of the pre-actions are down by 40%, which are really, again, not getting too technical, but some of these that are important to CPDA members, that's a key metric. So I think there's some hope that progress is being made. And the other issue with EPA is they're so antiquated on their IT. I mean, the ability to bring AI in, I think there's a desire to do that. We need to be able to have new technologies. We're doing it in the industry. EPA is working on networks from the 90s. So also kind of getting those technology and process improvements moving forward is a key piece as well. Well,
Andrew, clearly this is important for the producer. It's also important for the manufacturers of these products, these innovations, because these backlogs, for some products, some molecules, for example, that may have a patent that's very unique, that is new, that historically has taken, you mentioned, 2-3 years to get through the system. If that stretches out to 10 years, that patent life shrinks away. And so the incentive is kind of gone, isn't it?
Right. I mean, that's the incentive to innovate, right? I mean, again, that's what I think is part of the American agriculture success story is that innovation, and then having that incentive to be able to get to market in a timely way, recoup those investments, and we're losing some of that, right? And so
Right.
that's why this, again, is critical, not just from a 1 to 2 year delay, 5 year delay frustration. It's also a longer term picture. If you're looking at investments and say, you know, you look at some companies that are getting sued state by state, and you've got all those headaches on the backside, but then there's all this cost and investment, and then you sit in regulatory limbo. You don't want investors and those decision makers going, it's not worth to invest in agriculture, because we're all going to lose, the farmer
Right.
and the consumer.
Well, you said it clearly. There's been movement here, and there's been good collaboration amongst the industry, and really government's been pretty responsive here most recently.
Yeah, most recently, especially. Again, we're a nonpartisan organization, work with both sides of the
Sure.
aisle, but I do have to give some kudos to this administration. I know there's been some movement and reductions in force, and obviously you got to have people that have some concerns, but they've been able to move some folks into the Office of Pesticide Programs. They're implementing process improvements. So this is kind of a scenario where government's working better than it has been. And again, we're going to continue to push that for CPDA. Again, it's a priority issue. We've been very fortunate as a smaller association that we've had 2 opportunities to testify before Congress this year to talk on this issue, particularly in the House Ag Committee back in the summer. We had our chairman. So it's always looking for those opportunities to tell your story and
Right.
advocate for your members.
And you guys are doing a great job of that and bringing this forward. One of the areas that you've been very invested in, CPDA has, is this whole Endangered Species Act, ESA, another lovely acronym,
That's right.
for our growers to really understand. And if you're not familiar with ESA, Endangered Species Act, Andrew, this isn't anything new. ESA's been around since the 70s. But now it's getting some attention. Tell our listeners a little bit more about ESA, Endangered Species Act, what it really is, and how it could potentially impact their day-to-day life.
Yeah, ESA, Endangered Species Act, is not anything new. It's a law that goes back to the 70s. It's one that has, through court cases and interpretations, evolved over time. It's something the industry, on the manufacturing development side and registration side, you had to take into consideration. We obviously don't want to put anything on the market that harms the environment or consumers.
Right.
And so that's always been a consideration. But now, because of some of court decisions, some of those responsibilities are now going to be put further on the grower. Growers have always been good stewards. They live where they work and raise their children, always following the label. The label is the law, but we are going to start seeing some additional requirements on labels. We saw the first ones this year in 2025. We expect more in 2026. And as they go through the registration process and the re-registration process, you're going to start seeing more and more of these ESA requirements that growers really going to have to pay attention to. Again, label is the law, being compliant with that. It can be a little complicated on how you navigate it, because it is going to go product by product based on the chemistry and the potential impacts to species in an area. So different parts of the country might have a little more difficult time than other parts, but there is a ton of resources out there for the grower that EPA's put together and industry's putting together. And we've come a long way. They put out what they're calling the strategies: herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, fungicide strategy. And this is kind of the framework they're going to look through each product as it goes through. And what EPA really initially proposed was unworkable. Mm-hmm. And the grower community, our industry came together and said, "Look, EPA, this is not practical, real world." They listened, and now we've got better mitigation options for growers. There's the runoff side that you've got to hit so many points, again, depending on chemistry. There's calculators and tools that are out there for growers to look into. And then there's the drift side. And so those mitigation options are going to be critical to have flexibility. One of the big things CPDA worked on is we've got adjuvants. We've got our members that make drift reduction adjuvants. EPA recognized those in the herbicide strategy as a mitigation option. The other option would have been 10, 20, 100-foot buffer zones, which is not sustainable. Nobody wants to see that.
Or even feasible in a lot of places.
Right. Yeah. It's just not possible. But with the right nozzle, right boom height in your sprayer, and you throw a drift reduction adjuvant in, we can get to zero in a lot of cases on those buffer requirements. So again, that's kind of an easy button. Instead of taking land out of production or taken us backward in conservation practices. You think about herbicides and our ability to do no-till and all these different things. From a sustainability standpoint, it really wasn't what was best for the environment. And so we continue to work with the agency to expand that into the other strategies. We delivered thousands of lines of data to EPA that's been tested in wind tunnels. We've worked with the industry, worked with researchers to really let the agency know that this is a real option. The science is there. And again, it's that focus to be an easy button for a grower going forward.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of practical solutions has really come out of ESA through your good work, industry's good work over the last 6-8 months.
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of progress there. It's still less than ideal, right? It's a different regulatory requirement put on a grower, but there's just so much good work that, our extension agents, a lot of people may have heard Stanley Culpepper. He's here at the conference. He's out of Georgia. He's done a lot of work with his growers. It's, again, that partnership with our land-grant universities, industry, farmers, and then ultimately the regulators to come up with practical solutions. Again, kind of a thing where government's working. It's a headache that was imposed. We want to be good stewards. We went out and found the science to say we're going to be good stewards, and we've made it a little bit easier to comply.
And moving forward, ESA is going to, as you mentioned, put some more restrictions, some more steps in place for growers. And some of those steps include, before we go spray anything, these are some things we have to do. There's websites to check, and really reading labels is going to be critical, won't it?
Right. And it's always been critical to read the label, right? We've got to apply it by law. But this is going to be potentially one extra step depending on the product. But there's, again, online calculators, resources. You go in, you check and see what the requirements are, and then you get to see what your mitigations options are. And so hopefully that's that mitigation option we've made a lot more practical than when we were a couple of years ago. But it's something you're going to continue to see as more and more products come out. Again, it's something growers need to be aware of. But that's where I know, again, I mentioned our extension agents are out there prepping to make sure growers have the information that they need. But again, collaboration, coalition type approach, CLA, CropLife America, ARA, Ag Retailers Association, and CPDA, we've all come together to put not only grower resources, but our ag retailer resources. We've been working with the science societies and our certified crop advisors to make it as easily digestible as possible for the grower at the end of the day. And so you're going to see more of those kind of rolling out over the next couple of months. CropLife Magazine, we're doing an insert to kind of help the industry be a resource to growers as well. That's going to come out later this year. We did one last year, the ABCs of ESA, and now it's kind of the mitigation options for ESA. So you're going to see more resources to help growers.
And I think it's really important for our growers that are listening on this episode that, folks, don't stick your head in the sand. You really be engaged and really understand what's going on. This isn't really hard. It's just extra steps that's still going to open up a tremendous amount of opportunities for you to utilize, crop protection products in a more efficient and effective way.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's us always trying to get better, be better stewards. And again, not losing sight from the MAHA discussion to just the kind of deep in the weeds, no pun intended, regulatory piece. We've got to have crop protection tools. That's just the reality of the abundance we are blessed with. They are thoroughly reviewed. They're safe when applied correctly, following the label, but they are just critical to underpinning the bounty that is American agriculture. And it's not always a sexy subject, but it's an important subject because it's kind of our foundation of being able to meet the growing demands of a growing world.
As producers out there across the country, now is probably an important time than ever, really, Andrew, to be engaged. Growers really need to be engaged because as I've talked to you and I've talked to other lobbyists in Washington, they're certainly taking time, administration and Senate and Congress, taking time to listen to, advocate groups like CPDA, CropLife America, and others. But they're really, really, really listening to those that are farmers at the farm gate. They want to hear from growers, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. They get tired of hearing from us lobbyists. But again, the power kind of comes from that membership constituency base behind that. Politics and policy making is a full contact sport. It's a poor frog who won't croak for their own pond. And there's this overused cliche that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so it is just so critically important to join your commodity group, join your farm bureau, join your industry group, and be engaged. Particularly, there's some easy buttons from an advocacy alert asking you to send a letter or make a phone call, to obviously being a resource to your member of Congress back in the district. Invite them out to your farm, tell that story. If they do something good, let them know it. When they do something boneheaded, which they all do, let them know it. But it's so important to be engaged in that process. And then there's opportunities to come to DC and do a fly-in. We have our CPDA fly-in coming up March 2nd through the 4th. There's fly-ins all the time, but those are so important because you're bringing your story from back home. You're showing that this issue is important, that you're willing to go meet with that congressional staffer or that member of Congress. And so it's just so critical that we are all telling our story, because if not, others will. And there's too much importance and too many challenges out there for us to stay silent. And when ag works together, pulls together, it is incredible what we are able to achieve, being such a small slice of the population, but a critical industry that everybody should care about.
Yeah, definitely. Andrew, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today on the FieldLink podcast. Thank you for your good work, CPDA's great work that you guys do on a day-to-day basis, and helping ensure that we have crop protection products and adjuvants and agrotechnology at our fingertips so that we can produce a more profitable crop on a daily basis. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Hey, and now we're going to head down to Nashville to have Jody Lawrence join us. Jody, happy 100th episode of FieldLink Podcast.
Well, thank you, Bill. That's an amazing accomplishment. It's due to far more hard work between you and your teams and Cooper and everybody else than me. I just kind of show up and talk. So we appreciate everybody listening, and it's a nice milestone to know that this has really developed the traction that we hoped it would.
Yeah, you bet. I absolutely want to thank all of our listeners for being loyal listeners, joining us here for the FieldLink Podcast, and always picking up an episode with Jody as we talk about the commodity reports. Jody, there's a tremendous amount going on in Washington these days, and you've got a report that just dropped this morning. Let's talk about the quarterly stock report.
Yeah, the quarterly stocks report, obviously by the title, comes out once a quarter, always at the end of the quarter. And what it does, they go through and adjust upward or down just the U.S. domestic stuff. They tell you what the wheat crop expectations are for the year and any adjustments to the ending stocks that they see coming. And this year, this quarter, unfortunately, they added 195 million bushels to it. And what that really what question that answers is when the stocks number came out in the January and February reports of being, about a 1.25, somewhere down there, the expectation was that the old crop, just call it July contracts, would gain significantly on the new crop, because the stocks were tight and demand's been really, really good. But what happened is that basis levels never did what we thought they would do, and the spreads never widened, old crop over new crop. And what everybody kind of was concerned about, and what they finally adjusted in this report, adding that 195 million bushels, means one of two things. Either they were a little light on last year's corn crop by about 2 bushels an acre, or a combination of things in between, a little less demand and a little bit larger crop. But then the kind of the avalanche of problems that the bulls have had for a long time is when you add 195 million bushels of corn to ending stocks, it's just like adding 2 bushel per acre gain in this year's crop. Mm-hmm. And what we were hoping for, and what we are seeing in about the first quarter of the yields, is that the Eastern Corn Belt drought did cut off some yield. And we were hopeful that, not that we want anybody to lose yield, but it just that we would get an accurate number, down around 183 for this year's crop, that we could get a 440 to 450 type rally to get some of the new crop sold. But with this offset, I think now we could take yield down to 182, 183, and not have a significant change of position, unfortunately. So just ongoing frustration with numbers and big production and a lack of just any demand growth inside corn or beans domestically.
Yeah, we just continue to, the theme feels like, the demands is simply not there, both domestically as well as globally. And then to get this news, oh, we got 2 more bushels per acre from last year's crop. It's just adding a little bit of insult to injury, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's everybody, when the USDA is for you and they make prices go up, everybody says, well, it's about time you got it right. And then when they come up with a number like this, it's like, well, they're just determined to, keep prices down or whatever. But I wouldn't want their job. But the joke that I always make is, because they have so many columns to deal with, that if the USDA did our taxes, we would be in jail.
Yeah. Yeah, that's and they do have a tough job. I think that's really important for us to note here on this podcast. That is not an easy job discovering, where these numbers land. And that being said, we've got some movement happening in DC as we're recording this podcast. I think we're about 11 and a half hours out, Jody. We may have a shutdown. That could certainly impact some additional reports coming out of the USDA, as well as other policies that were potentially in play.
Exactly, because you look back on the first Trump administration when they did the same thing. It was a December, January shutdown. It shuts down all of the USDA report functions. So there are no weekly export reports. There are no daily flash sales of what's going on. And the bigger one moving forward would be the October 12th yield update. So if this lasts for a couple weeks, which, once it starts, who knows how long they're going to do it. And it certainly looks like they're not going to be able to reach a deal, that the market is then left not necessarily flying blind, because there's so much information out there available right now. But without the confirmation from the USDA, you end up with the market maybe drifting a little bit more than normal this time of year, when certainty about harvest totals is usually what we get instead of uncertainty. But with this, the interesting parallel is that when you go back to the first shutdown and Trump's first administration, they didn't put out the January report for until about almost 6 weeks after. And and that's usually a major, volatile report to the market. The market just kind of shrugged it off, because the markets have gotten so incredibly efficient about finding out all of the information available. And honestly, it makes for a really good argument that, do we really even need these reports with the availability of all the information through social media and all the other outlets? So it's it's an interesting argument that we're going to find out, because I'm pretty sure the government's going to be shut down.
Well, certainly things are evolving there. We'll know in about 11 hours. We're going to know when this podcast drops whether we have a shutdown or not. But to your point, if we do have a shutdown, boy, oh boy, it could raise a lot of questions. Do we really need this information or not? And, you can get on both sides of that fence down the road. But to your point, we've evolved a lot. We've got a lot of information at our hands that we've never had before. And that could certainly help navigate the future of markets, grain markets, as well as some of the predictive analysis that's out there. Jody, let's pivot slightly. Let's talk about harvest. Boy, I tell you, I'm in Wisconsin today recording this. Jody, I've saw quite a few combines up here as I was making my way north. What's the harvest report from your seed right now? What are you learning?
The crop is drying down very quickly, and everybody is in the position that they're grateful for the dry weather to let the corn dry down, because it was a high moisture crop, a month ago. And with the extra expense, they don't want to get the dock for extra moisture or have to pay the natural gas bill to dry it down. And now harvest is moving along at what you would consider a very normal fall pace for a record crop, because that's, some people look at it and go, oh, the crop, the harvest is 3 or 4% behind normal right now. And, that normal pace takes in about a 180 yield, not a 185, give or take yield. Just takes longer to go out and grab all, when it's a bigger crop. So it's the yields have, I think, consistently, not in a big way, but have consistently been below expectations. It's just a matter of if the USDA decides to say the final crop's 183 or 184. But as mentioned earlier, with today's finding of an extra 195 million bushels, they have 2 bushels per acre to play with, that it won't affect the market one way or the other from, where we've been kind of hopelessly stuck in December corn futures between 415 and 425.
Yeah, and definitely, based on some of the long-term weather, it looks like, at least now as we're recording this podcast, boy, weather looks pretty favorable for harvest for the next handful of days, and we're going to get a lot of harvesting going in. And, it could raise a question and some eyebrows of how's the storage looking, Jody? I mean, goodness sakes, as you mentioned, we just found a couple more bushels per acre from last year's crop. How is that going to impact storage this year?
The storage system is going to be overwhelmed. And I've talked to several elevators and several producers that are having a real problem with basis because the elevators simply don't have any room, and they have to make it worth their while to, start more corn piles or do any number of things. And they're just killing basis. It's, and I've talked to several people that it's 30, 40 cents lower simply because the elevators are trying to motivate every farmer out there with extra bushels to figure out a way to keep them on farm, whether you leave them in the field and harvest slow, whether you get bags and put it in there, or just stuff your own bins rather than bringing it in. It's going to be a problem, because not that it happens infrequently, because we keep having these record crops, and certainly this is the busiest time of the year for the elevator system, but it does present a problem when, especially the price for basis for the things that are going on now with the farmer's balance sheet, that again, back to what you said, the insult to injury of, okay, now we've taken off another 10 or 15 cents
Right.
off price. So it's just a unfortunate situation. And again, we're the victims of our own success.
Yep. Well, you know what? Hopefully this weather treats us well. People get things harvested safely, and, we're going to just have to roll with the punches for sure. But Jody, let's move on to oil. Crude, we've had some movement there here recently. What's new in the oil world?
Crude oil has been interesting because you ran up to make new 2-month highs last Friday on what we thought were going to be some international developments of what was going to happen as far as NATO dealing with Russia. Were they going to try to be able to avoid buying Russian oil, which would give us stockpile in Russia, but it would also create more demand coming out of the Middle East or the United States? And what has happened because of it, OPEC has raised their production levels, and it looks like NATO is not going to take the drastic step of putting an embargo on Russian oil, especially European Union, because they're just kind of stuck having to use it. So it's backed off from that. It's a pretty solid $3.5 pullback. So if you need to top off some tanks, we're back down to the lower end of the range within about $1. And you look at diesel's trading at $2.30, and you're a lot closer to the lows in that 225 to 228 range than you are to the highs. So maybe a good time to take advantage of a pullback to go ahead and top off your tank so you can finish harvest.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Take advantage of this opportunity when you can, as we're trying to manage all of our resources and inputs as producers. Taking a look at oil right now might be a really good thing as we get right into harvest and start planning for 26. Jody, want to thank you for joining us on this 100th episode of FieldLink, and thanks for being a major contributing partner of ours here on the FieldLink podcast.
Well, thank you, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be involved in it, and I appreciate everybody's hard work. And Always the harvest message for everybody that's listening: please be safe out in the field, because this is a dangerous time, and want everybody to be back next week and next month to be able to listen to the podcast.
Thanks for joining us, Jody.
Thank you, Bill. Have a great week.
Thanks for joining us on this 100th episode of FieldLink. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the FieldLink Podcast on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode.